Hi, I'm Reggie Ponder with the Kaleidoscope Group, and I am happy to be here with Mitch Brown, Senior Consultant of the Kaleidoscope Group. And today we're going to talk about 4 ways to show diversity and equity even without having an outwardly diverse leadership team. And Mitch, I I'm excited to talk to you about it because you're in the trenches helping companies and even leadership teams address the issues that they're facing today. And the reality is that many of these leadership teams don't have diversity on these teams. Can you give us this preview of these 4 ways that you think people can address diversity and equity?
Yeah, great question. First of all, happy to be here with you today. You know, it's always a pleasure when I get to connect with my man Reg. That being said, you know, 4 ways that I think companies, and even more than what I think, working with companies day in and day out, I'm hearing some things, right? And I'm hearing what accountability looks like for diversity, even when that representation is not found in the middle management or most oftentimes senior management levels of an organization. So, first and foremost, the first thing I would tell people to do is to identify where their inequities, where their disparities exist. Okay. So, I'm going to ask you to turn inward, look at your organization. The first thing you need to do is do some real work and what I call corporate soul searching about your data, right? And you know that's going to tell you a lot of things. And once you're able to do that, I think the next thing you need to do is to communicate, right? So transparency, communication, messaging is very important. And what employees are oftentimes looking for is a signal to say, hey, that I am bought in, that I do care about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the backdrop of not seeing it. All right. We want to see what you're doing or going to do about it. Then we want to know what are you going to do about it. The next thing that I think you could do is focus on, you know, real development and real accountability measures within your own organization. So again, identification, communicate your plan, and then the next step is around strategy, which strategy to me is about what are you going to do? Who's going to do it? When are you going to do it? And that's in your development plans, and that's in how you hold people accountable. It's not enough to communicate a plan or a strategy if you don't have the follow up. And then lastly, I think the fourth step is that, you know, the first three are really focused on Reggie, companies turning internally. The last one is externally, right? So a lot of times what we might hear with regards to representation is that there's not a diverse enough candidate pool, right? And that's not something that we particularly like for our clients to rest their laurels on. Our clients are, you know, some of the most, intelligent, go-getting, passionate people who represent these organizations, and they are in the business of figuring out complex and comprehensive problems. Never let that, you know, diversity be one of those issues that, you know, stops the flow, if you will. So the same expectations that ones have for accomplishing some things that they can do, you know, in terms of the wheelhouse of their business, have that same energy, have that same expectation for, you know, what you can do with your people. So we're going to think outside the box with the fourth element, Reggie, and it's about how do we enrich the talent pool, right? So those first three things, turning internally, doing some corporate soul searching, and then, you know, how do you enrich the community to, you know, provide opportunities for underrepresented talent. And there's a myriad of things you can do in enriching the talent pipeline.
Wow.
But those would be the four things.
Wow, wow. So those are some good things, Mitch. I have to say though, before we even get into those 4 things, here's the problem as I see it. We're at this time right now where the whole George Floyd uh, situation, what it did is it had a lot of people saying, "Wow, I didn't recognize this. I didn't know that these were problems." So your first one is to talk about soul searching, but how do I really get to that soul searching when I've never really seen, I don't even see that as a problem. Your second one is to talk about, I think it talks about, well, where are some of those inequities that you can see, I, but I, work seems pretty good to me. The way in which we operate our operations and the things that we're doing seems to be working. So you saying soul searching? I'm not really sure that I need to do any soul searching. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, great point. I think first and foremost, inclusion as a principle starts with a couple different things. And one of the things we often talk about is like, the heart. And it's about kind of in this place of, uh, is there a belief that inclusion is something that's important, that's valuable to not only my organization, but to the sustainability of a great and productive society, great and productive communities, and as a microcosm, a great and productive organization. So if you start in that place, right, with that belief, I think that gives you the impetus to do something like a corporate soul searching. Now, that works for some people, right? We also have what we call the head, and that's where people want to understand, where's the value in doing something like this. And I think, if you're willing to understand that there's a direct correlation between talent and your organization's, ability to drive outcomes and reach goals and objectives. And if you assess that, that diverse talent is important to that equation as well, well, there's the call to action. That's why you might want to be looking and understanding what's happening, especially if the data or the disparities suggest that people are leaving at a rapid rate. If people are, complaining maybe in your focus groups or on their surveys about, hey, I don't have any real opportunities to advance within this company, then you're actively, you might have some disengagement or some active disengagement from a particular body of folks within the organization. So, the
Wow.
question is to, why should I? Or, I feel like, everything's going well. I don't have to do this. I think I would challenge organizations to, think about that a little deeper in terms of, am I aligned with my values around inclusion? And, how can I understand how this makes me a better operational entity?
So I'm that ally. I'm that white ally that's working in the company. I see that from a representation standpoint, the leadership team is not diverse. I am concerned as to how do I navigate and help to push through, because this is a real issue for companies where there's someone inside the company saying, I'd like to do something. Something needs to be done. I've done that kind of soul searching, but how do I push this forward? Because I don't really have a diverse team outwardly as we look at our leadership team.
Yeah, I think after you understand, what your disparities are, or even, as we say, what's your call to action or your value proposition by just looking internally at your data, I think the next step before you even get into what should I do or how can I be a better advocate or a better leader is to really communicate your intentions. And this is important for so many different reasons. One is just the idea of the efficacy around goals. There's data to suggest when you think about doing something, and then when you think about doing something and compound that with writing it down, think about doing something, write it down, and then tell somebody. The likelihood that you're going to follow through to meet those goals and objectives just increases. The correlation is there. So I think communication is important because it signals, right, what commitment looks like. I think it's also important because it helps the greater body understand, how the sausage is being made, or at least that sausage is being made. Maybe you don't know what's going into it, but hey, we got something that's coming down the pipeline, and that's gives people a sense of hope and optimism, which is important. So I think those things, before you even get into, how do I focus, how do I do this? I think those things are kind of important to start with in terms of, communicating. And then as a leader, as an advocate, you got to really challenge some of the processes and practices within your organization that says, what's leading us to this outcome. We talked, a lot this past week and the week before internally about companies understanding, what's the outcome that you're trying to achieve, and not necessarily what are the things that you're trying to do. Could be a very much different conversation. And usually leaders, people who are champions are in that spot of, how do we achieve a better outcome? And I think that's some of the things that needs to happen, conversations that need to be had.
One of the words that you use a lot in our discussions is being courageous, that you have to be courageous. And Mitch, what you're talking about right now, I'm gonna have to put myself out on the line for this stuff because I don't have a lot of support systems. I think that this is important to do. And you asking me to be courageous, man. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost, when you're dealing with representation, and maybe representation in this aspect is about race, and it may be about your black employees or other racial ethnic minorities within an organization might say to you like, "Hey, I'm looking around. I know that this organization hangs its hat on certain values and principles that are important. You seem to care about me, right? But I don't see a lot of myself represented here." So that means once you go through the process of identifying what data and disparity looks like, communicating, the outcomes and what you want to do, well, then there comes the actual change part, right? There comes the actual disruption. So courage plays a huge part in disruption, even more so in the idea that you're doing disruption at the bequest of like maybe underrepresented population. So you're going against the majority culture normally when you're disrupting some change for this. So you're going to have courage to stand up and say, you know what, this is important. This is something valuable, because you're going to have to deal sometimes with people who may not see it as such. And then when you talk about, Reggie, around disrupting policies, rewriting, things that are codified. When you're talking about doing things from practices in terms of how teams and how people manage and how people make decisions, that's where the courage button comes into play. You got to press it, and you got to be willing to be able to sustain it.
And so, man, you just are going down the list here. And so the strategy part is the one that's a little tough for me though. Is that shouldn't I have, before I even get into all this, shouldn't I have strategized before? You say I should look at where the inequities are, then I should communicate it, and then the strategy comes next. From a from a process perspective, talk to me why is strategy there in your mind?
Well, I think you want to be able to have strategies supported by data. And I think that makes it real, and it makes it intentional, and it makes it something that's correlated to something that's going to lead you to where you want to go. So, we've talked about, my advice or my suggestion here is to look at some quantitative data on the things that you're doing internally. But, you said something interesting there. You'll hear some qualitative data. Anecdotally, people will give you a hypothesis to kind of test if you're having some issues around representation. I'm sure if you, like I mentioned earlier, if you got some different, tools or modalities to check the pulse of your employees, they probably mentioned it somewhere along the line, right? So you got all these things that I think are helpful to support a strategy. And that way, because here's the reality of every situation or organization does. There's some priority that needs to be, in place. So a lot of times, if you don't have the data to inform the strategy, it's hard to get a, discernment around what priority looks like. And priority might be from timing, might be from resources, right? It might be from a myriad of different decisions that has to be made about people who seriously want to make a change. So I think that's why you order the steps in that way. And that leads you to a point where I think your strategy is going to be, more well received. People are going to buy into the strategy, which is also some important things around, again, how effective the strategy will be, how successful you will be, is how well you can get people bought in and thinking it's the right thing to do.
I am so glad that you spoke to this issue of buy-in, because I was gonna ask something about this, because okay, now I've done all that, and I know your fourth point. I love your fourth point is external, but I want to stay here just for a second about the buy-in. Now I'm kind of out here on my own. I've assessed some things, saw that we had some inequities here. I communicated that we need to address these inequities. I've strategized as to how we should do that. But now I need some buy in. I need some help, because it's not going to happen if I've done all of this stuff by myself. Can you give me a couple of tips on buy in?
Yeah, I think you need to do some great relationship mapping. If you're a change agent, you need to understand the players and the game, right? And oftentimes we try to understand the game without knowing a little bit about the players. And I think the best you can do that, especially within the context of understanding decision makers, understanding influencers, understanding who might have weighted input in terms of some of the things that you're trying to do to make your strategy go or make it happen. For instance, if development and coaching is a part of that strategy, right? We might want to talk to some managers who have many different direct reports to get some insight on, how might we incorporate our strategy into what they're already doing. So buy-in is really about working your way up and down the, I would call it the strategy plan in terms of the operation cycle, if you will, or delivery cycle. Who are all the key parties that I might need to be in contact with? You're going to have to do that. I think it's prudent to approach those situations with a critical eye on your own plan. Relationship map, have a critical eye on your own plan. That way you ask great questions. That way you know how to maybe address maybe concerns that other folks might have. And it's a really, really important thing. Now, the idea is that you might not win them all, right? You might not win everybody. But when you think about change, we often teach people, Reggie, that, you're really dealing with a 20-60-20. And what that means is like 20% of folks are resistant. And, you got to do your job to kind of, bring those folks along. 60% of people are in limbo. They're in the middle. So, those are the people, by doing some of that great relationship mapping, by, giving some people some things that they need for themselves to, get the buy-in. That's who you're winning over. So again, that's why it's important for buy-in. It's a healthy kind of thing to do, especially when you're talking about disruption, and usually in this space that we're talking about, probably doing something unique and new for most organizations.
Well, excellent. So now we turn ourselves externally, and your last point is to participate and not just accept that, oh, okay, the pipeline is not that good. And I really like what you said here is that we these organizations solve real complex problems all the time, but maybe sometimes when it comes to this issue, kind of defers to the fact that there's not really too much that we can do. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's about thinking outside the box and being creative. And what I want to ensure is there, we praise and we look for innovation and creativity in all aspects of the business. And I don't want us to stop short of the human capital component, and not just only acquiring the human capital, but again, when they're there, and even before you reach the start out for the acquisition process. And that's what creativity is about. It's about looking at the critics of maybe your goals and your objectives, and saying, in what ways can I, right? If the thought is that, hey, there's not a lot of diverse talent out there, well, what's one way I can impact that, right? What's one way I can change that outcome? And it's really to start before the acquisition process starts, right? And then do things to enrich the talent pipeline. And one example I'll just give, I was having a conversation with, a client maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and we had this kind of conversation. This is where I really put this into my kind of philosophical repertoire, if you will. And it was about like, how can we do something that's not normal? And we started talking, and we started saying, well, what kind of ways outside of the workplace could I influence? Then we started thinking about the different contacts that this person had. And here it is, we're thinking about, well, wow, this person's in a certain industry and they're a part of professional associations, right? And those professional associations do some things that are community driven, or community more focused in nature of some of their objectives as an organization. And what a cool way to connect those two things in terms of, oh, if I'm going out here and maybe showing underrepresented talent or communities and schools about roles, industries, and this was finance and insurance that this particular example was about. Here are the type of roles that you can have, right? If I'm talking to high school kids, or a college freshman, here are the type of classes you might need to be taking and thinking about, right? So there are different ways that you can think about, how do I enrich the talent pipeline? That's just one example. And again, even within that example, it's around, going outside of the same places that we usually go to catch fish. If you want to, catch some grouper, then Reggie, you got to get out of Lake Michigan, right? You might have to go somewhere else. So, that I think that's a big piece of the puzzle too.
I love this, Mitch. Our time is up. I appreciate that. If you could just recap those 4 steps for us, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Number one, you want to identify, right? Identify what disparities and inequities you might have. Number two, you want to communicate those results in your plan for the future. Number three, you really want to work on inclusive strategies that work on implementation, other things that can look to affect change. So what are you going to do? How are you going to do it? When is it going to get done? And then the fourth, strategy is around turning externally and thinking about what are some of the ways that you can do some things that enhance your community, enhance the talent pipeline. And those are some of the things, if we don't have diverse representation at the top of the house, and if we're serious about diversity, equity, inclusion, and changing that, I think that companies can focus on.
So before I cut us out, my biggest takeaway from this is that as an individual in a company that might not have an outwardly diverse leadership team, I still have power, I still have influence, and I still have responsibility. Am I reading that right?
You read it completely good, completely right, completely good. I'm on board with that. You got responsibility, you got accountability. You could have some accountability. You got an opportunity, no doubt about it.
Thank you so much, Mitch. I appreciate you, man. And man, I can't wait till we talk again.
All right.